The synthesizer is dead. Long live the workstation. Those were words from an article in Sound on Sound in 1995 reviewing the Yamaha W5. Let's talk about what the reviewer meant when he wrote that. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, turn your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music tech related. And today, in Since That Time Forgot, we are talking about that time Yamaha killed the synthesizer in their production line, the Yamaha W5. And honestly, that's probably a little premature to say. They hadn't totally killed off the synthesizer at this point, but this represented a shift that was to come with and really culminated in the motif and the 20-year reign of the motif, where synthesizers and programming sounds on kind of a granular basis became not popular and became not something that was paid attention to for the most part from synth manufacturers. So let's talk about what was happening and what the W5 represents. One, it's god ugly. I hope we can all agree on this. This thing weighs a ton and it's super ugly, and this is an ugly moment in synth history for me personally. It represents the rise of the workstation and the dominance of the workstation for a good 20 years. So when did this happen? When did it come? The digital synth history in the 90s for Yamaha is really interesting. They released a ton of modules and keyboards, and this is kind of right in the middle. It was released in 94, 95, and it comes after kind of the flagship SY series they released in the early 90s, which was kind of the next innovation or the next kind of take on synthesis from Yamaha after the DX FM era. It was a reaction that kind of SY series was kind of a reaction. It was also confused because there was the Vector Synth, the SY22 and 35, and then there was the SY77, SY99, which were like AWM and FM engines where you kind of mixed in the sounds, kind of like, not unlike the D50 and the M1, some of that, definitely in dialogue with those synths, so like SNS style synthesis. And this came after that, and basically it lost the FM, and in place of the FM, in place of really programming on a deep level, it was just advanced waveform kind of memory, and it was AWM2. And really as I've played with it and as I've kind of gotten the sense of it, it's really all about the sequencer. It's you can do some kind of, you can build sounds with elements via the AWM engine, and you can create some interesting patches, but it's really more focused on the 16-track sequencer with like 100,000 notes that you could program, and really it was appealing to having an instrument that you could bring that could do a full track in itself and has had enough sounds to do all the instrumentation that you needed. So in a lot of ways, it was more of an arranger. I mean, it was a workstation, but it feels a lot more like headed in the arranger direction than in heading away from the synthesizer direction. The other thing that you found, I think, or that you find in this kind of like workstation movement is the things that you would take a basic kind of AWM sound and then you would modify it with a whole bunch of effects and a filter, sometimes no filter, but effects and LFO filters, and in this sense, and then ADSR, and in this sense, what was interesting here too is that there's a lot of preset patterns for different kind of ADSR shapes and envelope shapes and whatnot, and LFOs. You could do a lot of kind of just, instead of actually programming it, they had like 30 presets for the envelope and you could apply those. And so it was trying to simplify synthesis down so that you could focus on sequencing and song building. And I think that's the story of the workstation. And I don't think it was totally figured out at this point, because what you get after this, you get the EX5, which I think was the last synth for a while from Yamaha that allowed you to program pretty deeply as well. There was like more last flagship synth, I should say, because there was some virtual analog instruments like the CS1, AN1, and some other some other things that were going on in the latter part of the 90s. But in terms of like flagship instruments, the next one you got is the EX5, which had almost all versions of almost all of their digital technology that they developed mixed with the workstation features. And that was the last time that they really included a lot of that for a long time. Then you get the Motif. And the Motif was kind of the 2000s workstation, which really dominated for a long time between all the synth manufacturers. It was all about packing in the Swiss Army knife performance instrument, packing in as many features as possible, performance features, sequencing, all sorts of stuff, sampling to get the sounds you were missing instead of programming sounds. And the magic of programming your own, kind of doing your own synthesizing kind of was lost, and there wasn't a lot of instruments devoted to that. And that's kind of how I view that story and what I've pieced together just as we played these instruments and looking at the design changes. I think that's really what was going on. This wasn't terribly successful. I think Yamaha was still trying to find their way for the consumer after their wild success with the FM, the DX. They were still reacting and trying to create a dominant player in the market. There wasn't a whole lot sold. They're relatively rare. They're super cheap. They sound all right. They have some interesting sounds. These older digitals have got a much darker tone. And I think and their effects are all a little different, and some of their effects are kind of cool and weird, kind of like vintage guitar effects. They just sound a little bit different. So let's take a listen, and we'll conclude with some final thoughts. So there you have it, the Yamaha W5. I didn't demo all the sequencing functions or anything like that. It's a tedious thing to program. I'm not that interested in it. And the buttons on this one in particular need some service, as does this dial, which I think it's like the only time they used a dial because it didn't work that well and people didn't like it that much. It's like an alpha dial. But the sound is not bad, and some of the patches in here are actually really nice to listen to. And it's interesting also, you see there's patches that you find in like the SY77 and the SY22 that make their way into this, and that you find as all the way up into today's keyboards like the MX88. There you see some of these AWM2 kind of sounds that have made their way from like early 90s all the way into the 2020s. But what's interesting is that when you play them on different instruments from different years, they actually have very different kind of tonal characteristics, because not all the technology changed, the DACs changed, the way exactly it created the sound changed, the algorithms and the effects algorithms changed. So it's actually kind of interesting, even though it's kind of misleading that even they might have the same patch on one of these early instruments, it sounds totally different if you hear it the MX88 today. So personally, I don't think it's worth what they go for. I mean, this is one of the more painful instruments to lug around. It weighs a ton. The buttons seem to have issues. It's not hard to kind of get into the different features if the buttons work, but it's not my favorite of the digital synths. The SY77 and the SY22 and 35 and then 99 are way more interesting to me personally, as is the EX5. So I think this is forgotten, a synth that time forgot for a very good reason. It really is more of a workstation and more of a death synthesizer, kind of a precursor or a prophetic kind of synth for what was to come in the 2000s. Would love to hear your thoughts. What do you remember about the W5, if anything? Did I mischaracterize this kind of trajectory? I'm really having a fun time piecing together this digital history because I don't think it's particularly well documented or talked about as much. So would love to hear your thoughts and dialogue more about it. I obviously don't know everything and really appreciate the feedback when people fill in missing pieces in the story. And I think other people do as well in the comments. So please leave a comment below. Or if you want to talk more, come find us at almamusic.com. You can chat with us, email us there. Would love to see you there as well. And thanks for watching. If you didn't hit the subscribe button, would love to see you here again. And until next time.